with us. We have an amazing conversation with a group of amazing human beings up here this morning. My name is Jessica Loretti. I'm the managing director of the Anthem Awards. The Anthem Awards are brought to you by the Webbies, and it is a new award and platform to honor purpose and mission-driven work from brands, organizations, and individuals from around the world. We're now in our second season, and we have just been starting to, post-COVID, launch a bunch of community events, and we knew how important it was to come to DC and bring folks together to talk about everything that's happening and to talk about the midterm elections, which are right around the corner. So we have an amazing conversation, and Alencia, I'll kick it over to you to get us started. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here talking with you all about some issues I love to talk about. So I'm just going to actually introduce you by your name and your title, because I want you all to talk about how you got involved in politics and activism. So we have Ronnie Cho, who is the CEO and founder of the Cho Group. We have Shaniqua McClendon. Did I say your last name right? I'm so sorry. Early morning, no coffee. Vice President of Politics for Crooked Media, and Maurice Mitchell, who is the Executive Director of the Working Families Party. So good to see you all. And so would love to just start with you, Ronnie. How did you get involved in politics and activism and your journey to where you are now?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and thank you everyone here for joining us. So I got into politics sort of in a weird way. I'm a son of immigrants, Korean immigrants. They came to this country, I'll be 40 in December, so 41 years ago. And grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, in a very immigrant kind of upbringing. Would be familiar to many folks who are first generation. We were very poor growing up, lived in a car and in and out of, the first couple of years of our lives, just kind of finding work, trying to make a way when there was no way. And, when we settled in, my parents and my family just sort of instilled this value, a very simple thing. It wasn't political. It was, work hard, don't be a jerk, help those who have less than you do, speak up and fight for those who can't speak up and fight for themselves. We didn't have a whole lot ourselves, but we knew there was folks who had even less. And that sense of values, I think, has informed everything that I've done ever since. Again, not political, but a values-based worldview. And at that point, as immigrants, my parents, and I think anyone who's been around immigrants or been around folks from elsewhere, no one loves America or the idea of America as much as folks who are new to this place or are trying to get to this place. And the opportunity and the hope and all of those things that we think about when we think about America as an idea, I think is most concentrated in folks who are the least familiar with America. And so now that we're in this country, we could do anything. And in that sense, I wanted to help my community and my working class, both sort of working class immigrants, lots of undocumented Mexican families in my community. And I wanted to make it easier for folks who embraced my family, who didn't look like them, didn't speak a common language, and decided that I was a Democrat before I even knew that was a thing. And I just got started. I volunteered, took the 19th Avenue bus downtown Phoenix, and at the age of 13 years old, this was 1996, and just volunteered. And I've been more or less doing organizing ever since. And I will say, in 1996, Bill Clinton won re-election in Arizona. The first time a Democrat had won the state of Arizona since Harry Truman. And in 2020, I helped advise the Biden campaign in my home state of Arizona. So I've been involved in the last two Democrats who've turned Arizona blue. I don't want to take all the credit for it, but it's a common denominator there for my home state.
Little flex, little slight flex. Shaniqua?
Yeah, first, is this on? Sorry, I can't ever tell. I think it is. Maybe?
I don't think the mic's on.
He's running like it's not on.
And for folks who don't know, Ronnie, the two Democrats that won Arizona, President Obama.
No, President Clinton and President Biden.
President Biden.
Yeah.
Yep.
I also worked for President Obama way back. Shaniqua and I were just talking about this. I started in Iowa in '07. February of '07, I was hired on that campaign, which feels like a million years ago at this point. And was able to join the White House and pursue a career in public service in this place. I lived here for about 6 years, and it's good to be back in D.C.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was going to say thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. Similar to Ronnie, I think some of the democratic and progressive principles that I have now were definitely not identified as such when I was growing up, but I did know that I wanted to help people. I am one of 3 children. My parents, they had us pretty young. At 19, they had me and my twin sister. And then they split up probably 5 years after that. No, a little longer. Anyway, we moved to North Carolina. My mother struggled. She had 3 girls. I think she was about in her late 20s, just trying to figure everything out. My parents didn't go to college. So my mother initially started working at KFC, which she hated and only lasted there 2 days. But she ended up becoming an administrative assistant. And so she was making about $22,000 a year, raising 3 girls. And so we did not have a lot growing up. But education was something that had always propelled me forward. I saw what education could do for people. And so I ended up going to college. I want to major in business, though, even though I love education, because I figured we didn't have a lot growing up. So I need to make a lot of money so that I can have an adulthood that is very different from my childhood. But then as you get older and you start understanding life, I started to realize that we didn't grow up poor because, just because my parents had us young or just because my parents didn't have college degrees. There's a lot of decisions that our elected leaders make that lead a lot of people to live in these circumstances. And so that's what got me very interested in public policy, specifically education policy, because I felt like education was something that really made a difference for me. That's what got me interested in kind of public service and public policy. And I was telling Ronnie this before, my senior year in college, I became obsessed with Barack Obama when he was running for president.
Me too, girl. As we all did.
It's literally actually why I moved to DC. I ended up getting an internship for Barack Obama in 2010, and I stayed here for 7 years after that. But while I was at the White House, the Affordable Care Act was passed. And so being there during that time and seeing that process was just really exciting to me. And it made me want to actually go work on Capitol Hill. Obviously, Barack Obama did a ton to get ACA passed, but I just saw what was happening in Congress and all of the work that they had to do to actually get that over to the president's desk to be signed. And that was what led me to Capitol Hill. But throughout my life and even my time on the Hill, I've seen what public policy can do for people. Initially, I thought education was the only policy that could help people. And then I got taken off of education policy and I was very upset about it and only wanted to work on what I thought were real social issues. But I had been giving transportation and telecom. And so I was very upset until I eventually learned those are social issues as well. Whether or not people can, access jobs through transportation, are the unfortunate kind of decisions we make pitting public transportation and roads and bridges against each other means the difference for people having access. Or even, I started to notice things like where bus stops were in back where I live. And a lot of bus stops were just in the middle of dirt, not even on an actual sidewalk. And so just seeing all of those things is what, has gotten me into politics, but has continued to capture my interest with doing this. And now I work at Crooked Media, just leading our civic engagement work. And that was a recent shift. My 6 years on the Hill were interesting. I learned a lot. And I learned that, it's not just one party that has problems in it. And so my work now, I like to think of it as a way to make sure that not only more Democrats are elected, but the best Democrats who are actually going to fight for people who are in need.
Mo, over to you. I saw you shaking your head to it's not only one party that has some issues.
Good point. Well, first of all, just really appreciate being here with all of you, and thank you for moderating, and thank you, Anthem Awards. So I feel like there's a through line here with our stories. So I'm actually the child of two Caribbean immigrants. My grandmother came here as a domestic worker, worked in people's homes. She left her family, she left her kids in Trinidad to send remittance home in the late 60s. And eventually, she was able to bring everybody over. And so I grew up in this extended family, a lot of aunties and uncles and cousins, and I learned a lot. And absolutely, my politics and the work that I do is informed by their struggles, by the values that I learned in that context, and then also what I observed. I very early observed that race, class, gender, immigration status in this country present barriers to people being able to live full and complete lives. And so very early on, I wanted to do something about that. And I did not know that there was a way that somebody could like make money being an organizer or any of those things. But I very, very early on, I knew I wanted to walk in the path that was laid down by others involved in the freedom struggle that my parents often talked about at the dinner table, coming from countries that had to free themselves from colonialism and being very animated by the Black struggle, both in this country but all around the world. And that brought me, so that really animated all the decisions, that major decisions in my life, from being a youth activist in New York on Long Island to my decision to come to DC and specifically come to Howard University, which is not far from here, and following the footsteps of another Trinidadian, Stokely Carmichael, who also went to Howard and was involved in SNCC, and my activism on campus, focusing on the criminal legal system and police violence. A classmate was killed by the police, and that really animated a lot of us and politicized a lot of us on campus. And then my further decision to, after my 4 years of college, go back home and get my hands dirty organizing on the ground. And then what I learned while I was organizing on the hyper-local level in working class and poor communities on Long Island, mainly communities of color, was that there were limitations to what we could do when we came together and organized on issues. And those limitations were presented in the form of policy. And the way that you change policy is by being able to change the representatives that are writing the policy. And that's really how I got involved in elections and the political front of the struggle. It was really informed by the grassroots organizing and the limitations that I found. And it's like if you keep on hitting your head up against the wall, at a certain point, you could continue to do that, or you could break through the wall. And I think elections can be a useful tool for people if they could organize themselves to break through the wall. Like, organized capital has money, right? People, we still have the levers of the democracy. Mm-hmm. And so I'm always interested in figuring out the strategies that people without means could use those levers in order to advance our issues. And that, to close, that same instinct brought me to St. Louis when the people of Ferguson and St. Louis really changed the world. And I was really inspired by the young people on the ground, and I threw my lot in with them. And for 4 years, helped to build the movement for Black Lives and helped catalyze it to be an international movement. And again, I saw limitations because we had sort of posed questions and surfaced contradictions that had to be answered and contradictions that had to be resolved. What I learned was the people who answered those questions were not the same people who posed them, mm-hmm. right? The people who got to answer those questions, like, well, how do we deal with violence against Black people? Were people sitting in state houses? Were people sitting in city halls? And generally those people, the answers were not satisfactory. The answers were corporate answers, like, oh, we'll buy body cameras, right? And, now body cameras are on police all across the country, but Black folks are still getting killed. we're documenting it, but we haven't dealt with the root causes, right? And so that informed my decision to lead the Working Families Party. I've been at the Working Families Party for 4 years, trying to merge the interests of social movements and the grassroots with the ability to, up and down the ballot, be able to elect movement accountable representatives that will sort of cohere the ideas and the urgency of the ground into policy.
I love that. All of you have such a depth of experience from policy and organizing and campaigning and activism. So we're talking about advocating for a progressive midterm. And I really want to talk about the history of the progressive movement. But before I get there, and Maurice, I want to actually start with you. I'd love to define this term progressive, because we hear it, we're in Washington, D.C., we're having this conversation, we use these terms, but the everyday people we're trying to move don't necessarily always know what these terms mean. So I'd love for you, and anybody else who wants to jump in, to really define the word progressive. And also, like, can we talk about how folks have kind of weaponized it against a lot of us as a bad thing? I mean, I dealt with it when I worked on Senator Warren's presidential campaign, and we know that these values actually work for the majority of people, so.
Yeah, I think it's worth defining, right? Because of how it gets bandied around, right? And for me, progressive simply means folks who are interested in advancing the country forward and who recognize we are in the wealthiest country in the history of countries and have so much capacity, and therefore we should at the very least be able to meet the standards that other countries that have less capacity, less resources have, and ensure that people don't have to come out of their pocket in order to deal with life-saving issues, and that we have a robust healthcare system, that people don't have to go into debt because they want an education, that childcare should not be something that people have to struggle for, that, and again, all of these things are popular, right? So the other thing is, all of these issues that are called quote unquote progressive issues are also majoritarian issues, right? When you poll it again and again and again, like the lion's share of Democrats, a majority of independents, and a lot of people identify as Republicans and conservatives agree with these issues, right? And so to me, progressives are the ones who are offering the policy solutions that would make the most change in people's lives, and also the policy solutions that will bring the most people together, regardless of how they identify. And when progressives get in office and when progressive change happens, a good example would be the IRA was recently passed. Billions of dollars, right, for climate change, billions of dollars to deal with the healthcare system, make it fairer, and surprise, it's really, really popular, right? That's evidence of the popularity and the common sense and the both like the ethical reasoning of the progressive movement. And yeah, people throw around terms, but basically it's people are interested in moving the country forward.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is, thinking about how people weaponize the word progressive. It's because whenever I think about politics, I'm always, it kind of just falls into two big categories. You have people power, and then you have monetary power. And I think the reason that this word has been able to be weaponized is because people have a lot of money. The people who, when progress happens, they lose because they've amassed all these resources and quite frankly oppressed a lot of people to be in these positions of power. And so now, you have all these people who are pushing for more, but they don't necessarily have the resources that those other folks have to continue to push this narrative that, oh no, we should have all the money and power so we can help you people who don't understand how to take care of yourself. When in reality, we do know what we need to take care of ourselves. We just don't have it because, those folks have taken it all for themselves. So I think something that, I was going to say all Democrats should do, but sometimes they're part of those people who have the power. But, I think progressives can just push back. Conservatives define us so often, and I think we need to spend more time defining them, but also reclaiming that as a positive word that has gotten us so far. If you look at the history of this country, without people pushing for progress and taking that power back from the people who are holding on to it so tight, I mean, the four of us wouldn't be sitting here right now, you know?
Great. Yeah. Would you all like to add anything about like the history of this movement?
Yeah, I'd add that I think, going back to the progressive age of the early, late 1890s, early 1900s, it was on the heels of a Gilded Age, right? After the industrialization, massive wealth accumulation concentrated among a few industrialists that urged this, ushered this era of massive social reforms. Does that sound familiar to anybody? I think we're on the cusp of another wave of this kind of reaction to a concentrated wealth in a certain number of sectors, mostly big tech and finance and those places, that's going to demand some real reforms. And I think we're seeing some of that fruition when it comes to, I think, this next generation of progressive age would be a demanding of more workers' rights in a similar way that we saw, 100 years ago. I think a generation of Gen Zers, millennials, as they call it, geriatric millennial, starting to see a need for this collective, And when I think about the definition of progressive, I think it's a value set of, are we better off together or are we better off on our own? And I think that's the foundational premise of what that means. And how you define that is up to you. I think there's a little bit of an ink blot kind of what that means in your own mind. But I think, are we better collectively than we are individually? And there's, I think there's a toxic strain of this libertarianism around big tech that we don't need regulation. We're the smartest guys in the room. We know what's best for you and to deliver, goods direct to consumers. That sounds like a nice, easy, seamless way of delivering goods and services. It's also fraught with all kinds of bad stuff when things are deregulated. And I think when it comes to voting rights and expansion of voting rights, I think in our lifetime we'll see, and in many places already being implemented, where the voting age is lowered down to the age of 16. You can have more undocumented people having the right to vote in places like New York City, where I live. There's going to be, I think, a huge, massive sea change of what we define as progressive values, not as progressives from a political standpoint, but progressive from a value standpoint that are broadly popular. Right? They're broadly popular, as you mentioned, across the board. And I think we're on the cusp of that. It's not predetermined. We have to force ourselves to bring these things to be true. But I think they're at a point where, if you look at the rise of Trumpism, there are some through lines of folks who believe that they've been treated unfairly, that they themselves can't afford to live a life of dignity. So they are holding themselves to the extremist, most horrible sense of politics out of this pain, out of this fear, out of this suffering, the indignity so many of them suffer, in the way that so many people of color, people that we grew up with, people we know, have also felt that same pain and that fear and that indignity. And so I think as people part of the progressive movement, I think there's a tendency to define to an extent where it's exclusionary, to be gatekeeping of what it means to be on our side. I think we need to break those open and to invite as many people to be a part of this collective vision for what is good for the country and good for the earth.
You're touching on something that leads into my next question of the values within progressive policies and issues, and how it's about the collective, right? And how history is also kind of repeating itself. I'd love to know then, how do we take some of those lessons into where we're going next? And how do we build that collective coalition again? Because a lot of what has challenged us over the past century was this division, right? Like the people in power literally knew, oh, let's divide these movements because they're becoming too powerful. But now people are coming back together. I would love to talk through, how can we organize around these values and build that collective again?
I think this moment in history is one of the best opportunities to do that, right? So labor unions are wildly popular, right?
Yeah.
And working people, some of them part of formal labor unions, some of them not, are organizing against some of the largest corporations in the world, right? And working people, however you might identify, wherever you might live, we have a lot in common. And so I think a politics and an organizing that is based in the day-to-day lives of regular working people. If we need to get back to the nuts and bolts of organizing, what makes organizing beautiful is it creates a space where people could see themselves in a world where you often are not seen. As a worker, you're often not seen or appreciated. And when you begin to see yourself and you begin to be in conversation with others, then you realize that your condition is actually very, very similar to others' conditions. And that eventually you realize that there is a collective condition, and you could come together and actually leverage your power to change your condition. And this, I think, given the fact that, just like you said, the economic picture is such where the very, very wealthy are getting more wealthy. We've just gone through a pandemic. Regular people are wrestling with, all over the world, are wrestling with some really hard challenges. And I think it would behoove folks in the Democratic Party, folks who are interested in being able to meet people where they're at in this moment, to validate people's experience, which is something that I think, ironically, Trump did in some ways for his movement. Mm-hmm. He validated people's experience. He articulated some truths about our broader system, the fact that our system is rigged in some ways, our system is a byproduct of real corruption. And then he told a story that led them to right-wing populism and ethno-nationalism and everything else. We have a story we have a story as well. Our story benefits from also being true, right? But part of it is telling people the truth about the systemic problems, but also the fact that regular people that come together can change the system. In fact, historically, we always had. And it's our side that has been historically the side that has done that well, and they could be in that tradition today. I think that if we're able to do that in this moment, we could begin to create a majority. Mm-hmm. We could begin to develop a new sort of popular majority around progressive change.
Yeah, excuse me. I think something else that has to happen, and I still struggle with this. I remember being very upset with a professor who ended his class on this note. But those who have the capacity to do it, I think we have to have these conversations about race, because I think that is where you see a lot of the division. It's very hard when Trump has done a masterful job of talking to a lot of poor white people and telling them, these people over here, these people of color have taken everything that you're supposed to have in this country. Because now they don't want to deal with those people. But these, these people of color and these poor white people, they have the same plight as Maurice was saying. There's a ton in common, and if we could come together, we could start to push back, on the powers that be that have all of this control. And the thing I was alluding to with my professor, he essentially said, you have to make space to have difficult conversations, but hear some difficult things from people who have been told that you are the reason that they don't have the things that they want. I still am not 100% in a place to do that. But he told a really interesting story about a gentleman that for over the course of 2 years, this man disagreed with him on everything. And he invited him to fundraisers and just all these talks. He had lunch with him. And he finally started to get through to him. Now, do I think we can take a one-on-one approach like that? No, but I think as we think about how we're messaging the progressive kind of message, we have to be able to say, you have been told all these things. It's probably gotten you to feeling the way that you feel, but let's really be honest about the fact that you've been told these things so that you won't fight for the things that you actually need. Come join us in this fight to get these things. And on the other side, I still struggle with hearing this, but it is true, and you mentioned this earlier. Now I've lost my train of thought. Sorry, you said it earlier. What I'm trying to, what I'm trying to get to is basically that, there are these other people, there are poor white people who have the similar interests as a lot of people of color, and I think we're going to have to understand what they've seen and heard and why they've gotten to that place so that we can make space and feel like this is an actual coalition that's going to do something together and that can trust each other. Because I think that is probably the thing I'm still struggling with, that trust that, we won't get to this moment and then, our, big pot of gold is at the end and then it's, the people of color are told again to go to the back. And so I don't actually know how you solve that, but I do think that is a big part of us, moving toward progress.
Yeah, I mean, well, part of trying to get to the solution is at least naming it, right? We have to name the racism and the white supremacy within it. And I love that all of you were talking about this coalition that was actually together historically, right? Like poor white people and low-income folks and immigrants and people of color, like we all were organizing together. And then the powers that be said, nope, y'all too powerful because it's too many of you all. And that's how we got here. And then sadly, I think some of this too, going back to what you said about the parties, now those of us on the left have been pitted against each other. So you have Democrats kind of weaponizing progressives and all of these things that actually makes it really hard for us to even get on the offense and build this coalition. One of the messages that folks are constantly hearing, and Shaniqua, I think I want to ask you this question. Well, get out and vote. We actually haven't mentioned anything about voting on this panel. We've been talking about organizing, but would love to just hear your thoughts on how do we get that message to folks who feel that their vote actually doesn't matter. And I understand that, right? I understand why people feel that way. And then two, as we're talking about messaging, you work at Crooked. Why is the messaging so important, and what role does the media play in all of this?
Yeah. So in regards to voting, I am the biggest voting cheerleader you will ever meet, but it's never the first thing I tell someone who feels that their vote doesn't matter, but the people that they elect, regardless of what party they are in, they still have the same outcomes in life. I think something that we have to do before we just demand that people vote is, one, recognize why they might not want to participate. Don't assume that they don't care and that they're apathetic, but understand that they actually have thought about this and don't see the value in actually participating in the system. And then start to understand what are the things that are impacting their lives. Something, I want to do more of, and we've tried to do so far with our Vote Save America program, is starting very early to support groups who are having conversations with voters, not about voting, but about what they care about, what are the changes they want to see in their lives. I mean, having real conversations, because so often elected officials come in the last few weeks and hey, you should come vote for me. And no one ever asks these people, well, what do you want out of an elected leader? And so understanding that and making sure that the leaders that they elect are representative of the things that they want. And so we also need better people running. I think that in 2018, where we had the most diverse House, I think a lot of people saw people who look like them running, and not only who look like them, who come from similar backgrounds and upbringings, and actually understood what was needed needed in Congress, or the laws that we needed to pass. You think about someone like Cori Bush. I mean, the protests that she led to extend the ban on evictions during COVID. I spoke to a few people who worked within the administration, and they were like, no, that actually was what pushed us over the finish line. And so when you see leaders like that with actual tangible outcomes, I think you can start to get more people to vote, but that has to come first. I don't think you can demand people to show up and vote for you when you've given them nothing to actually support and you don't have a track record for it. Other thing I'll add on that is that's why it's good to have organizers run for office, because they actually have a track record that isn't tied to being in office already. And so they can point to that as something that they're going to bring into lawmaking. And then the media plays a huge role. My whole career had been in public service before I went to Crooked, but I was in grad school when Donald Trump won, and I came out of that experience. I mean, we all experienced that election, but for me personally, I came out of it seeing the role that the media played, and that is why I wanted to go work at a media company. But I wanted to work at a company that used their influence to increase civic engagement. And so Crooked was a perfect match for that. And we've just been able, and I'll be honest, the people we reach right now are people, they vote already, they just wanted to be told, where do I put my energy? Where do I donate? Where do I volunteer? But also the messages that we're putting out through our content are the messages that those people then take to the voters that they're talking to. My hope is that we can start to diversify the people that we're reaching and more directly reach the people that we need to mobilize to vote. But the messaging is important because that's what compels people, and that's just not with voting. I mean, you see advertising and marketing and how much money goes into that. It's because messages, they convert into action and get people to do things. And so we have to be thoughtful about the messages we're using. And I really, that's why I get frustrated sometimes with the Democratic Party when we're so focused on, you know, a small subset of the people who vote for Democrats and not actually speaking to the experiences of this broader coalition. And there's a way to speak to all of these people that is not focused on, oh, well, this sliver is the most important, so that's the message everyone gets. We have collective ideals that we're all working toward. And again, we've talked about it already several times. A lot of people just need resources. Income inequality is extremely high. Like, there's low-hanging fruit in the messaging we can use. And yeah, hopefully we'll get there. But the media plays a huge role. And the last thing I'll add, sorry, I know I've been going on, is we have a lot of media that has just become beholden to whatever critique is put forth, and they kind of like bend to it. And so as they are making decisions about who to cover, what to cover, how they frame things, if they say it's a lie versus, oh, this is just one side of the argument versus the other side, has a huge impact on what's then getting to the masses and influencing the way that they participate in our system.
I mean, the media has a huge role to play, and I think storytelling, a lot of organizers have realized that we can't count on the news media, so we're going to go to TV and film and do some storytelling to build this coalition. And as a comms person who's done a lot of campaigns, I hate that Democrats are so married to their message on those talking points versus like actually speaking to the audience that needs to be moved. And I'm going to turn to you, Ronnie, because I'd love to talk to you about the campaigns that you are working with and the candidates that you work with, because, you know, Shaniqua makes a good point. We got to run better candidates. We need to run different campaigns. And so would love to just hear from you some of the strategies you're putting in place in the campaigns that you're working with. And to be honest, where some of these electeds and candidates get it wrong and where they could do better.
Sure. Yeah, it's we need better candidates. We need better Democrats. And we need more effective Democrats. We don't just need more of them, we need better ones. I mean, I think about, you know, this Roe v. Wade being turned over. We had a lot of complacent Democrats.
Oh, yes.
You know, so we can talk about Republicans and take them at their word that they're hostile to a woman's bodily agency. But we also have to be honest with ourselves that there's some complicit Democrats who didn't do enough when they had a chance. So my approach to this is both as someone who ran for office himself, has been in campaigns, been in the White House, been in media, I ran social impact for MTV. So I've seen a lot of different things, and I've come back home to organizing and trying to get in front of candidates and recruit candidates who should win. And I think there is, I mean, I guess I'm a political consultant, a self-loathing one maybe at times, but we need to destroy and blow up the model of what we recruit, how we recruit, the kind of candidates, who's electable, redefine those kinds of things. And I think about my favorite, I have a lot of campaigns and clients, but my favorite one, and they all know this, is Lauren Underwood. She's a Democrat from Naperville, Illinois, and ran in 2018. I ran her race in 2018 in a Trump district, Denny Hassard's old district. Remember him? The longest serving Republican Speaker of the House, the same district. A district that Trump won by 4 in 2016. Lauren Underwood, then a 32-year-old nurse from Naperville, won that seat by 5. In a district, J.B. Pritzker, the Democratic nominee for governor, lost by 8. And I want to put that into context because this is a district that is 80%, 85% white. It's wealthy, affluent, white voters in the far suburbs of Chicago. It's not even just the western suburbs, we're talking about the exurbs of Chicago, who became the youngest black woman ever elected in the history of the United States. She talked about values, she talked about healthcare as a human right, she talked about representing the values of folks at home to the halls of Congress in D.C. And she won again in 2020, and was able to solidify a coalition of voters that didn't look like her, that didn't have maybe the same lived experiences as she did, but knew that she was rooted in the values of her community and was fluent in the language and just the iconography of that district, the way that the houses were shaped and the highways and how far the towns were from each other. All that matters. That authenticity matters. Now, if you were going to ask a consultant here in D.C., who is the candidate you would run in the Illinois 14th District in 2018? Lauren Underwood is not the person that you would put on there for a lot of conventional reasons, right? She doesn't look like 85% of her district. She has a district about 2% black. Fuck that is what if I can say that here, I know. We need better candidates that speak more compellingly about why that they are the best leaders for their community. We need to stop doing this templatized approach to campaigns. We're not that far from the DCCC and other institutions that I think are doing their best and doing better in recruitment in candidates and keeping a mind of what is authentic this time, who can tell them not just to vote, but vote for me and vote for our vision for this country, vote for our best interest as a community, what's good for us here back home, regardless of what leadership has looked like, because leadership has looked like a certain kind of person, a older, straight, white male has been the leader that we've been given, and so there's hard to break out of what is possible. So we need to start looking at this, the most diverse House we've ever had, and look at leaders like that as people who can come as themselves. They are enough. They don't need to change the way they speak. They don't need to change the way their values or apologize for anything. I think we need to demand more authenticity, a little rough around the edges. Maybe that's my working class background coming through, but I think people identify with a little candor, a little bit more an edge, but an edge in not a Trump horrible, insulting way, but an edge of honesty, trying to speak truth to power. That's what I encourage my candidates. That's what I encourage my my roster of campaigns to coax more out of. Don't sanitize your candidates. Mm-hmm. Make them who they are. Make them radically authentic, and let that truth speak more than a focus grouped messaging exercise that just gets sanitized over and over again.
It's sanitized, it's repackaged, it's told, this is the ideal candidate, and then everyone gets mad when we run these authentic candidates against incumbents who've been complicit.
Yes.
And we will get to that in a second. But they're doing it. I mean, I think about Ayanna Pressley's campaign when she ran against an incumbent. Tremendous. And all the major DC groups were endorsing her opponent, and look how she won, right? And now we're talking about three amazing black women, Cori Bush, Lauren Underwood, and Ayanna Presley. I think we should just elect a whole lot of black women, and we would solve all of these issues. If we elected
black women, I think we would all be in a whole other world.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine, but it's much better than what we have.
Absolutely. So, Maurice, I want to ask you, we've talked about some campaigns, we talked about messages, but you're leading, in essence, a party. Like, you're trying to build a political party. Yeah. And I honestly think if we have this radical imagination, we're building this coalition, it is a new political party. But talk about like how hard that is, right? Like, people say it, but like what's really behind it, and the purpose of Working Families Party and the work that you all are doing.
Sure, great question. So the quick answer to how hard it is, very hard. But why do we do it? Well, we do this, it's based on the basic premise that today, all around the world, governments are facing the problem of corporate capture, the corporate capture of government. And we have a rigid two-party system where one party has been wholly corporately captured, and then on top of that, captured by a right-wing racist political cult. And then the other party is partially corporately captured, right? And if you had to ask anybody the basic question, should everyday working people have their own political party? Most people say yes. And so that's what we're trying to build in this very rigid two-party system. Now, For us, a party simply means people coming together with a particular worldview and using elections as the main sort of site of struggle in order to do that, cycle after cycle. What we've learned is that simply focusing on discrete wins and not thinking about the long arc, you could win discrete wins, but you might end up in the long arc losing power. And if you could just take the script of our friends in the right wing, they have a long arc, multi-decade, radical vision that they nest everything that they do in. And so, for example, if they lose a governorship like they lost in Wisconsin because they're thinking about the chess game, then their legislature will change the nature of what a governor could do, right? So they're always thinking about the long arc, and they are focused like a laser on power, right? I think our side also needs to be focused on power for people, not corporations and the wealthy. And ultimately, what that means is thinking about and focusing on governing, which is what political parties do, right? Candidates get elected, but political parties think about governing. And governing is a complex web of things that you might need to do, right? You need to get people elected. But once they're elected, you need to create coalitions so that they could advance really popular policy that a whole lot of people in, the Chamber of Commerce or in, the real estate industry or in pharmaceutical industries are not going to like. And so then you need to build a governing coalition around that and get it over the finish line and see the connection between governing, organizing, and politics. And so that requires us to recruit candidates. And we've endorsed many of the candidates that we've talked about, and sometimes we've been involved in recruitment or, building the bench. So a lot of times we are recruiting candidates on the municipal level or on the state level, and candidates like Greg Kazar, who's going to be representing the Austin area in Congress, or Summer Lee, who is coming from Pittsburgh. There was a lot of right-wing money against Summer and against a lot of the candidates that we've supported. A lot of dark money from the far right is involved in Democratic politics, right? And creating the coalition where they could win against that dark money, but then we know that those same forces are going to try to be roadblocks when they govern, right? And so as a political party, we're working with labor unions and grassroots organizations and others to think about that full cycle. And I think, Shaniqua, you talked about the fact that sometimes people focus on GOTV. That's when you reach out to communities of color, right? We're thinking about our politics 365 days a year, right? I think our opponents want us to think about democracy and politics as one event, right? Election day, right? And what we attempt to do is broaden it. No, there's a lot of things that you could do inside of a political party, inside of the life of a political party in order to advance your interest, from candidate recruitment to being a candidate to volunteering on a candidate's campaign. Our candidates cannot win if it wasn't for the small dollar donations and the volunteerism of a movement of people. The other side has money, but we have people power. And so the fun things that we get to do at the Working Families Party is figuring out every day how we nest all those things together and how we sort of fuel the party based on the dynamism of this progressive movement that is really taking off. I think, my job is to make the Working Families Party and the politics that we represent a third force in American politics, to pull not just the Democratic Party, but our politics closer to the people and closer to all the interests that we talk about. The two things that we're constantly thinking about is like, okay, the Republican Party has been captured by a batshit crazy personality cult, right? And so it's our duty to join forces with everybody in order to defeat that personality cult. So that's job number one. But then there's a second job, right? Not just electing Democrats, but ensuring that people who are deeply connected and willing to fight for the interests of working people are part of the governing majority that could pass the legislation. And that's not always true if we're just focusing on the DR thing. There's another step, and the Working Families Party is an institution that is across the country building year in and year out the capacity to make that other step possible.
That capacity and what you all are building is so important and so powerful, and we've seen it in a lot of the most recent elections. And I might be biased, but that endorsement that you all will give to campaigns and candidates is highly coveted. And all of you have been talking about candidates and running diverse candidates and running candidates who have progressive values. And I think one of the things that I want folks listening to this to take back with them, it's not a bad thing to run against an incumbent. It's not a bad thing to have a primary. I think, listen, I obviously worked for Senator Elizabeth Warren in the presidential primary, but if it wasn't for that extremely diverse primary, President Joe Biden wouldn't be governing the way that he's governing right now. Now, granted, I think there are things that we would like for him to be a little more bold on, but there are still some wins that have come out of pushing him in that primary. So as we're talking about elections, Ronnie, you started talking about this, the Dobbs decision, overturning Roe v. Wade, having worked at Planned Parenthood for 6 years, saw it coming and saw a lot of complicit Democrats who literally cannot say the word abortion. I mean, President Biden had a hard time, still has a hard time saying the word abortion. I don't want to just stay on the decision around reproductive rights and freedom, but what are some of these critical issues? A lot of you have started touching on a lot of issues we need to be thinking about, not only ourselves going into the ballot box, but the people that we need to organize and talk to. So I want to hear from all of you. Ronnie, we'll start with you for sure.
Yeah, well, I actually want to just respond about the point about it's nothing wrong about primaries. I agree to an extent. I think we need to be smart about who we primary. And I say that because there are some people who are in deep blue seats who act as if they're in a swing seat, who take conservative, left, just barely left of center kinds of votes when they could be pushing the envelope big. Those folks, they need to be working harder for their jobs every single day. There are folks who, like Lauren Underwood, for instance, and I think Colin Allreds of the world, who are in these really tight swing seats that vote in lockstep with the folks in the progressive Democratic caucus that should not be primaried, that should not be having to force them to answer questions in hashtags like, are you or not supportive of the Green New Deal, right? Like, that doesn't help folks like them stay in power when they are in power doing the right thing. So I just want to make the small caveat, but I agree that in that Democratic primary for president, Joe Biden doesn't put forth the most boldest progressive agenda on the American Rescue Plan when it comes to infrastructure, to the Inflation Reduction Act. He's making my boss, who, look, I still have the IV drip of the Kool-Aid of a hope and change of Barack Obama, but he's making us look small in the kind of the magnitude, the impact that we're making. Joe Biden is doing this, okay? So I think with respect to that, absolutely pushing him in the right direction, delivering on these massive wins that are going to be looked at for years to come as huge achievements for the American people. Now, discreetly to your question about the issues, some of the core issues, I think we're kind of touching on some of the things that the president has delivered on when it comes to one of the bigger elements of the Inflation Reduction Act that I think doesn't get enough credit is that it's demanding that the richest corporations finally pay their fair share of taxes. It's not nearly enough in what we need, but it's a big first step that we got even the likes of Joe Manchin to support. Big climate change initiatives that we got the likes of Joe Manchin to support. Let's not make Joe Manchin the most powerful person in America. Let's not make Kyrsten Sinema the most powerful people. We need 2 more Democrats that make them essentially just irrelevant. But I think it's things like income inequality. I think it's about making that debt-free college. And we did this before. We made universal high school a thing. That wasn't a thing before when we decided that we needed to invest more in our people. I think universal health, like a single-payer healthcare, is a movement that we all need to get closer to, and I believe in our lifetime we'll see. I think there are a number of these initiatives that are not pipe dreams anymore, in large part because of our progressive wing of our party and the Working Families Party demanding that people have a response to these questions. And I think those kinds of foundational truths, like should you go to just because you want to get an education? Should you go bankrupt because you had an accident or you have a pre-existing condition? These are foundational things that I think most Americans can agree upon. Is the lives of our children more important than the right to have an AR-15? I think these are things that the vast majority of Americans agree on. We just need to be better at selling that and demanding that once you're in power that you deliver on those promises.
Yeah, this is going to be a very cliche. You've probably heard this answer several times, but I just think it's, the foundation of us getting any type of progressive policies passed is voting rights. It's something that I think we as a country have taken for granted. And because the deterioration was happening so slowly for so long, and then very recently, after 2020, seeing like these huge grabs, or I guess, further deterioration of our access to the ballot, that's going to continue to be the reason that, the gun lobby still has a ton of control, the reason that the Dobbs decision happened, and now state legislatures across the country are passing, crazy laws. I am from North Carolina. When I started working on Capitol Hill, we had 7 Democrats and 6 Republicans in our House delegation. And then the 2010 election happened and a bunch of conservatives were elected to our state legislature. And by 2012, after redistricting, the state was very heavily gerrymandered. The state's about 50-50 when you look at political affiliation. And now we have 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And I guess that'll shift a little bit after this upcoming election. But I say that to say they were able to take the votes of, a state that is split pretty in half and just kind of take all the power. And once they did that, North Carolina Republicans, I put North Carolina and Wisconsin Republicans kind of in the same bucket. They are very just agile, and whatever you throw at them, they will find a way to use it to their advantage. But by having voting rights the way it is, kind of not really there anymore, a lot of these elected officials have been able to just shape our political process for themselves, and there's no accountability. You look at a place like Wisconsin, North Carolina got rid of their supermajority, fortunately, but is always at risk of going back there. When states elect Democratic governors, that means that in a statewide election that can't be influenced by gerrymandering, people are electing more progressive options. But the state legislatures have rigged everything so severely that doesn't even matter. And if you have a supermajority, that means these democratically elected Democratic governors, if they veto something, it's overturned. And so we're just kind of at the mercy of people who have rigged an entire system for themselves. And I agree, Joe Biden and the Senate we have, with just one additional vote from the vice president, has done a tremendous amount of work. But Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema have way too much power, and we weren't able to get voting rights done this last year. And so that is something that, we all have to think about. And I know we all vote in the particular states or the district where we vote, but that's why it's so important for us to be doing all we can for everyone who's running for office. If Mandela Barnes or John Fetterman are elected, no, we don't get to vote for them, but there's other ways that we can support them, because them being in the Senate means we get to take that power away from Manchin and Sinema, and hopefully, even if it's only for voting rights, get rid of the filibusters, that we can pass that into law. Because leaving it up to the states, unfortunately, we're seeing that in places like California, there's really great voting laws, but then, you look at a place like Mississippi, which I'm not going to go on my whole rant about Mississippi, but Mississippi has a huge Black population, and they have a bunch of conservatives in charge. And, we're seeing what's happening, one in Jackson, but then this whole Brett Favre
thing, yes.
Situation with taking money and that's supposed to be going to low-income families and building arenas. And that is what happens when people don't have the right leadership, because when you rig our voting system, you're pretty much protected from any level of accountability.
Yeah.
Well, your thoughts on these issues and what we need to be voting on?
Yeah, I identify with everything that was said by both of you. Also, including I have to say, one of our tools in our arsenal, we're well known for the primary, right? And including what you say, the primary is is a scalpel, not a blunt object. And everything we should do should be focused on building the power and creating the impact that we desire. But onto the election. This election, both this election and the 2024 election, the only thing I would add is that it couldn't be more stark. When you consider what the modern Republican Party actually is and what they're actually doing and what they're openly saying they want to do. So for most of our lives, the Democrats and Republicans have agreed on like the basic framework of liberal democracy. Like, okay, we're going to vote, we're going to count the ballots. Whoever wins that, it's math, whoever wins the election, we'll figure it out next time. We're not going to resort to political violence. We're not going to do those things. And for the most part, that was upheld by those institutions up until this era. And so freedom, our fundamental freedoms, whether or not we want to continue to strive to be in a democracy, or if we're interested in being some form of a autocracy or lean into some form of neo-fascism, that's actually on the ballot in November, like in real ways, not in theoretical ways, in real ways, because the Republican elected officials on the state level and on the national level are saying this. They are saying this is what they want to do. This is the direction they want to take our country. So, there's one party that wants to limit our freedoms. And it's funny because the conservative and Republican movements have sort of captured the language of freedom. Mm-hmm. But, there's one party currently that banning books, the party of forced birth, the party of ethno-nationalism, of political violence. And then there's another party, given all the contradictions and challenges of the Democratic Party, and I can name all of them, is attempting to expand and to protect our freedoms. So that's that binary choice is fundamentally on the ballot. And I think it's, back to our original conversation, this election and the 2024 election is an opportunity to build a united front of everybody, whatever your political affiliation, that want to continue to try to experiment in this idea of a democracy and want to expand and protect your freedoms, which means we could create a coalition that includes people who identify as Republicans, people who identify as independents, and people who identify as Democrats, who understand that the choice between a Democrat and Republican is not a partisan choice. Mm-mm. It's a fundamental choice about the direction our country is going to go, towards fascism or towards democracy.
That is huge. And it is literally, I feel like all of us on stage have thought about that, like that could eventually be the choice that voters are making, but like we are actually here. And for folks to organize around that, to see people organize around that has been really powerful, but it's also very scary that is where we are. One thing I do want to elevate, Shaniqua mentioned Fetterman's campaign. For those who don't know, he's running for Senate in Pennsylvania, and Mandela Barnes is running for Senate in Wisconsin. Both lieutenant governors, both of them they can actually win. And Mandela would be the youngest Black senator ever elected. He is also a geriatric millennial like a lot of us. So I want to just wrap it up. We've talked about a lot of things. Some of it is kind of scary, absolutely. I believe, listen, I'm the daughter of a pastor, so listen, there's darkness before the light. I do believe that. Final thoughts from each of you to give all of us hope and yes, to show up in the election, but to participate in saving democracy.
Yeah, I'll just, say a cliche that democracy is an action. It's something that you do. Being a citizen is an active choice that you make in your community, whether it's at the city council level, school board level. Most of the action that we're talking about, the corrosive nature of upending democracy, is not necessarily only happening at the federal level. It's happening at county board of elections. Who administers your elections, and whether or not that can be certified or not is now up for debate. It's gotten so bad where you have the likes of a Cheney saying that Lynn Cheney is saying she's going to campaign with Democrats. They don't agree on anything except that there's a point in time in American history where we need to defend democracy. That's more important. I mean, geez, she drives me crazy because I have to say thank you, Lynn Cheney, a name that I've cursed for most of my life. In any case, but look, politics, brings strange bedfellows, I guess, in that way. But I just implore everyone to find some way to be helpful. It's a couple of bucks to a candidate that you found that inspires you. Give them your resources. If you don't have enough resources, give them your time. This is so important. We are defying political gravity here, right? We're supposed to lose the House, right? We're supposed to lose the Senate. The folks in power in the White House always is supposed to lose power in the immediate and midterm. We need to defy that. We've defied political gravity. We've defied the odds before. We can do it again. We have to do it again in 2024 and in 2022, certainly. And so just inside 40 some odd days, every single one of us have a role to play. You can't do nothing. You got to do something. Everyone can do something. And whatever that is up to you, but you need to do it.
Yeah. And I would not be a good employee if I did not encourage people to go to votesaveamerica.com to get that information. We have places you can volunteer and donate and then just learn about what's happening in your state. But what I would leave people with is this is not the first time that our country has faced, the worst of the worst. And we always have overcome. There's been setbacks, but we've always been a pretty resilient bunch of people, at least those of us who are fighting for progress. And I mean, this is hard. I'm not going to lie. I didn't get a lot of sleep last week because of work. And I know that's going to just kind of be my life for as long as I choose to stay in this space. But I know it's important. And I know that when all of us come together to fight for the things that are important to us, we make progress. Right now, it is very hard. And I know people since 2018 are sick of hearing this is the most important election of our lifetime. But the stakes are just getting higher. And we are at a point where if we don't push through, things could get, not just, this is supposed to be uplifting, they could get a bit beyond our control. And so I just hope that people know that throughout our history, if you look back to slavery, to Jim Crow, there's so many times that things were really bad and we pushed through. Donald Trump is another blip on the radar for that, not blip, larger than that, on the radar for that. But I just hope that people will understand that they have the power to do this. And, we do have parties, but I want people to understand that we collectively, separate from these parties, have power and we get to demand what we want out of them. Even though a lot of the right-wing conservatism is fueled by a small group of people, it's a group of people who have come together to exert their power. And if we can do that on our side, we can do the same thing and start to see results. So I just hope that people will know that. I hope they'll participate. And one thing I just want to add on to what Ronnie was saying, I hope you will also look further down the ballot. I just will never get over Arizona. Joe Biden won Arizona, but there were a lot of state legislators who lost their seats or some folks who didn't win because ballot drop off. People just didn't keep going down the ballot. They didn't possibly recognize the names that were there. And that is just heartbreaking because those same legislators that ended up being elected were passing a bunch of voter suppression laws in Arizona and states around the country. So those are the two things I hope people do.
Yeah, so I would not be a party leader worthy of my position and my job if I did not say, if you're interested in volunteering, if you're interested in supporting amazing candidates up and down the ballot who would advance a progressive agenda, defeat the far right, and ensure that people who are accountable actually are elected, you should text WFP to 30403 or go to workingfamilies.org. Now, saying that, so I agree with, again, what you both said. The thing that I would add, or I would remind people, so I think everybody here might have mentioned the Obama years. I remember when people thought the Obama campaign was exciting, interesting, but nobody thought he would win, right? Nobody thought he would win. And people had accepted the conventional wisdom that Hillary Clinton would glide to a victory. That didn't happen. I also remember on the flip side when everybody thought that the Trump campaign was some sort of a joke, and we experienced 4 years of Trump. I remember in 2020, during a pandemic, when the largest social movement in US history erupted for Black lives. And in every state in the country, including places like Wyoming and North Dakota and South Dakota, there were protests, sometimes led by folks who weren't Black, focused on the interest of Black freedom. That actually happened. That happened a few years ago. Why am I mentioning all these things? The conventional wisdom would have said, this is impossible before it happened, before it became very possible. And the feature that made that possible was what people together organized decided they were ready for. That's true in November, and the stakes couldn't be higher. And I would agree, we all have a role in the freedom struggle. We all have our respective roles. You know, you don't need to drop out and, you know, join the underground, right? But you can give small dollar donations. You can give your volunteer time. You can find local campaigns to get involved in. You can support in many, many ways. There's so much available to us to get in motion. And if everybody who voted in 2020 vote in this election, if all the folks who came together in a coalition to defeat Donald Trump show up in this election, then we will expand the Senate, we will hold the House, we will win the governor's races, we will do all the things that are necessary in order to hold on to the gains and propel us towards another opportunity to advance the freedom struggle in real ways, right? So I'm always amazed by the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act even happened, given the fact that Manchin and Sinema hold so much power in the Senate. And the Inflation Reduction Act both is insufficient and it's historic, right? And we have to kind of hold both of those things, right? Because cynicism, I think, is a political project of all those folks that don't want us to have freedom. And we can't sort of buy into the cynicism that says, oh, the corporations, they control the democracy, everything is rigged, I can't do anything, what am I gonna do with $5? What am I gonna do with like a few hours volunteership? Well, those $5 a month or a few hours aggregated across hundreds of thousands of people, that's a mass movement. And movements have always been the things, mass movements have always been the things that have shifted conventional wisdom from the impossible to the possible.
Well, on that note, I am inspired to do even more, even though all of us, I see these folks on the road are just doing so much to get us to that point of saving our democracy, but also to what you said, Mo, getting us towards freedom for all of us. And so I want to thank each of you, Ronnie, Shaniqua, and Maurice. I keep calling him Mo, but Maurice. I thank you all so much for your time here, and thank you all for joining us. And I will turn it back over to Jessica to close us out.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I think we just inadvertently shot the pilot episode of a new politics weekly debate show. So thank you again for being here and for all of the work that you do every day. It's so important. Thanks for everyone who's here, and thanks for everyone who's watching live at home. So again, if you're interested in learning more about the Anthem Awards, you can find out everything you need to know at our website at anthemawards.com and all of our socials and everything. Just thank you for being here. Thank you to George Washington University. Just would love to talk to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.